Hey, Alex.
Hi.
This has been quite a series. I think this is probably one of the longest series that we've done.
Yeah, and I've been thinking, I feel like it's very on brand for the sisterhood
Oh,
because it is about things that matter. It is about how we look at things in the world through a lens of the gospel. And it's about taking that next step and sometimes doing that hard thing in order to be a world changer for good right where we are. So, as we've been in this series recording and editing and responding to comments and all of that, I just keep thinking this is very much the sisterhood, this series.
hmm yeah, I would agree with that. And I think as a sisterhood, we really try to stand in that gap, right, between these maybe opposing groups or people who may tend to stand hard on one side. I think the sisterhood is really about not to overuse the concept, but being that middle ground, that place where people can come and feel safe. I think
Mm-hmm.
safety is a big value for us as we attempt to hold unity high, that people would feel safe in on this ground where we can come together. And and I do feel like this series was helpful for that and was really representative of just how we like to approach the sisterhood.
Yeah, well, knowing that we could not cover everything that needed to be covered on every topic. We covered some really big things in very little time. So obviously, it was just skimming the surface on how to talk about these things. And we didn't even really get into the topics themselves. It was more about how do we talk about them. And I just want to acknowledge that these are all topics that could have not just their own series, but they do have their own podcasts around them. And
Yeah.
so uh, we brought the conversation to the sisterhood because we think it is important and because it is who we are. And we acknowledge that we weren't hitting every angle of every topic.
So tell me, what is something you learned in this series? What was new to you?
Well, I will say that I have talked a few times about Dr. Julie Slattery's concept of sex being designed as this three-chord strand of physical response, emotional connection, and then spiritual connection or insight. And I think that's a really helpful tool for couples to consider where are we strong in that three-chord strand and where are we in a place where we could grow. And so I have found myself talking about that with other people, that concept. And then also the idea of if somebody shares some suicidal ideation or thoughts, just how important the response is the first time that somebody shares something. And then also um, just about being blunt and forward about asking people, is this something that's in the mix of thoughts for you? Um, that really helped me to have somebody say, just be direct in that. I feel like that's something I'm going to take with me for the rest of my life as I love people who are struggling. And so that was a really helpful, pretty specific nugget, but helpful for me.
hmm
What about for you?
Yeah, I would agree with those. I thought both of those were really important concepts to grab onto and just real practical with the one you just talked about. And I would also say, I think asking the question, am I the person to speak into this issue, is
Mm-hmm.
a really central question right now. There's so much we could apply that to, so much going on. Am I the person who is to speak into this? And then the secondary question, and to this person specifically,
Mm-hmm.
because maybe we are to speak into that in one arena, but maybe in this relationship, it's not. This is not the best place to be having this discussion. It doesn't mean I never have the discussion. It just means maybe I'm going to put this relationship in danger if we are really going there, and maybe it's not worth that. Maybe it is, but maybe it's, maybe it's not. So I think just that two-part question of, am I the person to speak into this issue? And am I the person with this particular person? And those really are two different questions because they're not mutually exclusive.
Right. Because we can have maybe a hard conversation on a particular topic with some people because we have the authority to speak into their lives, or we have the relational trust. But on that same particular topic, for whatever reason, it may be just the depth of the relationship, or it may be the sensitivity of the topic for that particular person or for our relationship. I think those are good questions, and we have to be willing to hear either answer when we ask ourselves that. We have to be willing to hear no and step back and walk away, or we have to be willing to hear yes. And that's when we have to step into that hard dynamic that is just sometimes just hard.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. And I think, layering with that is one of the things that we talked about in this series is, can you both come to the table and really have a discussion? And that actually requires mutual humility toward one another and respect. And if there's not going to be that, then it's going to be really hard to have a hard conversation, because hard conversations only work well if both parties are willing to respect the other and be considerate and listen, and truly listen, not just want to talk over the other person. So I think, gosh, there's just so much that goes into that decision and that dynamic. What would you say, Alex? What do you feel like are the commonalities? Because I did feel like we started hearing some recurring and repeating themes. What did you hear?
Well, you just mentioned humility. I really think that's the key to having conversations that are productive, because we can have hard conversations where both people are talking at each other and even answering and responding to each other. But unless you're coming with this idea of humility, and a few people mentioned the word curiosity, where you truly are trying to learn from the other person, I think those are key to taking the conversations in the right direction. Sarah talked about last week, relationships, especially in families, are bigger and stronger than individual issues or conflicts. And I think that concept can be taken into all of these places, all of these hard conversations, that if we remember that our relationship is bigger than our disagreement on a particular area, or maybe multiple areas, I think that really helps the tone and the posture. And then again, helps bring us back to humility because we're valuing the other person. So I heard that multiple times. And really, Dr. Slattery said that. She really talked about curiosity and wanting to listen and hear, and to remember that we are not people that have all the answers. It is our natural bent to feel like we do. That's just pride. It's sin. It's who we are as people. And so we enter into every conversation fighting against that if we want to be productive. Yeah. What did you hear as you were listening to all of these wonderfully smart and wise people talk?
I think it's similar. And I would just add to that something we talked about again on the politics episode with Sarah, of just, you can be right and you can be smart, but it doesn't make you wise. And I think about the biblical definition of wisdom, and you can look at many passages, but James 3:17 is one of them, and where it talks about what godly wisdom is. And it says things like it's peacemaking, it's considerate, it's submissive, it's impartial, it's sincere. Those are the kinds of things that make up a wise person. And really, you can take any of the topics that we talked about on the series, and you can say, am I a peacemaker in this topic when it comes to race, when it comes to politics, when it comes to sex with my spouse? I mean, do I have a heart of peacemaking? Am I considerate? I mean, am I submissive? And really, I think that couples with humility. What that just means is you're willing to really be humble to, another person. And I mean, anything, right? All of those traits we can apply to any of the topics. And we can say, am I truly embodying a wise person in this conversation? And that doesn't mean we don't hold on to our conviction. I don't feel like anyone said that. But what it does mean is that in holding on to that conviction, we can at the same time exist in such a way that reflects Christ. And that is hard to do, but it is our call, right? It is our call to look different and to really reflect Christ in who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think about just Shannon and Maggie talking about the call as Christian women to care for one another, that we do have a different level of responsibility. We do. We know and we understand the good news that Christ came to reconcile humanity. And it's in that knowledge that we have to move forward and act. We can't have that knowledge and not have the hard conversations required to move forward. And in a culture where we're so used to coddling our comfort, we want things to be easy and we don't want things to be hard. But sometimes what's important is hard. And we can have courage and we can step out in confidence because we understand that the gospel is about this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amen. So good. So what would you say, Alex, is something you learned that you didn't know before?
Hearing Maggie and Shannon talk again about their life experiences, I've heard some of their stories before, but it was just once again an overwhelming sense of exhaustion on their behalf and this sense of stress of what it is to live as a Black woman. Even the example that Shannon gave about Black girls kind of telling each other, listen, you need to suck it up and you need to be tough, and we don't have time for for your feelings right now. You need to push forward. And again, that was a generalization and we were talking in generalizations, but just culturally, that difference was striking to me. And so it reminded me again that listening to people's stories, no matter what the topic is how we get insight into how something is more than an issue, but is something that impacts people. Mm-hmm. And that's how we remember it, is through each other's stories.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really good.
What did you learn?
I would say there's something super practical I learned. Mm-hmm. We actually learned this from someone, from one of our listeners, not even from one of our guests, but I didn't realize the terminology had changed. When you say that someone has died by suicide, which is the correct terminology, you don't say committed suicide. Mm-hmm. So that is an old term that is no longer endorsed by people who are in that field, that you actually say died by suicide. So that was, I felt like, important to know, like, mm-hmm. what the correct way is to say that. And I think as we're trying to be loving to people who have experienced suicide, in some way, that we want to use the right terminology and we want to be sensitive to how we word things. So that was important.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that I got from the interview with Daniel Darling about social media was the concept. And again, this is a very obvious concept, but I think one we don't always employ. And that is that if you do feel led to respond to someone who has posted something on social media, that you certainly can do it publicly. And I thought you gave a great example of that. Wasn't it in Sarah's interview where you
Mm-hmm.
gave where you talked about, that it was important that other people saw the response and you did it in such a way that was honoring to the person. And so that's not what I'm talking about. But if you feel like you really need to respond to someone, most likely they're going to respond better if you direct message and do it offline, so to speak, do it off the public eye and just do it kindly and with gentleness. Again, gentleness, man, that is just something I heard over and over and over. Gentleness is key.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can, direct message someone and have a conversation and maybe engage each other in a way that is beneficial, that's a good strategy. If you don't feel like you can really pass that by, you need to say something. So I thought that was good.
Mm-hmm. And so counter to what we see out in the world. I mean, I feel like even since we recorded that interview with him,
Mm-hmm.
the toxicity
Oh,
online
I
has
know.
just gone through the roof in the last month.
Mm-hmm.
And so to remember that we can be countercultural in how we respond in the virtual space too. And that speaks not only to the person that we are responding to, but also to the other people who are reading the comments and the threads. And that is my hope as I respond to people, that I bring the aroma of Christ to Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
Why not? Why not?
Right.
Why not do that there? Um, as we talk about how we manage ourselves on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and it's where so much of conversation is happening right now. We're actually not having it all the time, person to person,
Mhm.
because people, because of COVID too, are more separated. So it feels like more than ever, the conversation is happening online. And
Mhm.
wow, is that interesting to watch?
Well, and you know what I found in my own patterns, which I think is probably true of most people, is that the more I'm fixated on the conversation that's happening virtually, the more I'm fixated on it. It
Yeah.
just feeds on itself. And, I'm a Twitter girl, and Twitter is just toxic right now. But I've seen people, even in the last couple of days, saying, I need to step away because I am just watching a train wreck in front of me and I can't take my eyes off of it, whether it's the news cycle or people's response to it. It it just is this drug almost that pulls you in. So anyway, um, it just is overwhelming. But I agree, people are more online partly because we can't be in person having these wonderfully rich conversations, I'm sure, if we were in
About the
person.
election.
Yes, I'm sure they would just be very productive. Okay, Krista, you mentioned something about peacemakers. Can you go back to that and talk about what it means, peacekeeping versus peacemaking? Because I, a few years ago, read something by Eugene Cho that really opened my eyes to the difference between the two. So when you differentiate, what are you talking about?
Well, so peacekeeping is really just peace at all costs, right? So peacekeeping is where you just don't want conflict, you just don't want anyone to disagree. So, who cares what I need to shove under the rug in order for there to be peace? I just don't want anyone fighting. I don't want anyone disagreeing. I don't want anything that's going to cause discomfort. Now, maybe it's not even a topic of disagreement. Maybe it's an issue that you just don't want to talk about, that needs, it stays in the dark, it stays hidden in order for people to feel comfortable and at peace, so to speak. But here's what experts say, but also what I've experienced in my own life, is that time does not heal all wounds, and that actually the more we ignore things, the
Mm-hmm.
more it is not at peace, the less freedom that we have, actually, and that things don't just go away, and that actually is really selling out. It's a cop out, and ultimately, and that it doesn't lead to wholeness inside of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what is then peacemaking? Well, peacemaking is where you are willing to bring things to light, and you're willing to go to the hard places and have uncomfortable conversations for real peace, for real peace. But here's the trick, and this is the trick to all of it, is that when there is a place that is not safe or that is highly volatile, people will go to a fight or flight response.
Mm-hmm.
So, Peacemakers International talks about this a lot. So, most of us fall in some, according to kind of how we tend to go in that fight or flight, we get really aggressive or we flee. And
Mm-hmm.
so we either like, we're out of here, or we're like, boom, like really negatively aggressive. And so we have to learn, one, how to create or be in a safe place where things can be talked about and things can come to light. And sometimes that's on us. Sometimes that's on us to create that safe space and to have good boundaries and say, in this space, we will not speak down to one another. We will not name call. We will not, whatever it is. We create those boundaries if we're in charge of our space, or it's that we find a space where maybe I can go with another person where we need a safe space. Maybe that's a counselor's office or a church, right? Somewhere where there's a safe space, because that's critical, because else you will go into fight or flight. So finding that safe space where both parties can be heard, where it's okay to say what is underneath your feelings and to share that. And then again, we're going to go back to that wisdom, that humility, right? All of those things, being considerate, gentle, that's what makes true peacemaking, is when you can, in a safe space, lay everything out on the table and receive a loving response,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of your opinion, but where you can just receive that loving response and feel accepted and heard. And that is freedom. Like, that is where our souls then transition to freedom. And so, in a nutshell, that's really the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The thought of giving somebody a loving response, it just right there makes me pause and question, okay, what would a loving response look like and I'm thinking of just, all the conflicts of the last week around here. What would a loving response from me look like? That's a great question to ask myself. Do you think people have a general fight or flight response, or within certain relationships, does it change? Like, I may be more flight with my husband, more fight with my kids, or, I just find family dynamics to be so interesting. But also I wonder, like in the workplace, if someone may feel more confident in that area than they do in their dating relationships, or what do you think? Do you think someone has a general tendency towards one or the other, or is it more situational?
Well, I do think we tend toward one or the other, and that can be across the board, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have different dynamics and different groups. And so but here's the thing. It doesn't really matter whether you are fight or flight. They're both unhealthy. You know what I'm saying? Like, some people say, well, I just don't engage it, so I'm healthier, right? As opposed to the aggressive person that's more fight. Well, it's actually not true. They're actually both equally unhealthy. And that's something that you come to when you start really studying peacemaking, is that you're like, oh, like, this person thought they were being so virtuous for not engaging, when actually that's just as harmful of a response as the aggressive one. Now, granted, we're not talking physical, right? So I'm just
Mm-hmm.
saying with words and with actions. Uh,
Tone.
with
Mm-hmm.
tone. Yeah, I don't mean actions,
Mm-hmm.
with tone. And so they're both equally unhealthy. So how do we get to that middle where you're lovingly engaging without getting aggressive and without fleeing? Because we do want to flee. I mean, one of the biggest responses to conflict or discomfort is isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And so you pull with it. Now that could be isolation from that relationship, or it could be like full on where you're like just shutting down in your home and you don't really want to engage. And so how do we really, really challenge ourselves to go to that middle place? And I think it is self-talk, and that's where we can get into neuroscience and all of that. I mean, even in my workout this morning, I was tired. I didn't want to do it. And I literally said out loud to myself, you can do this. I was doing burpees with push-ups, where you have to like go down, do
Mm-hmm.
push-ups. And I was so tired. And I was like, I don't think I can do it. And then all of a sudden I'm like, no, tell yourself. And I literally said out loud,
Mm-hmm.
I can do this. And I got down and I did, the 10 push-ups that I needed to do for my last set. And that's what we need to do. Literally, we need to say out loud to ourselves, I can do this. I can have a loving response, or I can be courageous enough to bring this up and actually tell ourselves, like, I can sit in that middle place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. What about you? What would you say, or how would you encourage people as they're looking at conflict strategies in
Mm-hmm.
hard conversations? How would you encourage people, or what tools would you give them?
Yeah, I think it's normal that conflict is going to come up when we're talking about hard things. And so I go back to the questions of what needs to be said versus what can be said. Sometimes when we employ a posture of, hey, I'm just being honest, we see this as an excuse or permission to vomit all over the other person with our words or our feelings. And really, we still need to be discerning in what is helpful and productive to this conversation. I may have a lot of things that are still unsaid for good reason because they wouldn't be helpful or productive. So just balancing that sense of, okay, we're entering into this conversation into hard territory. That doesn't mean I need to say everything that's hard. It means what needs to be said in order for us to move forward in a healthy way. Because I think we could say, oh, no, I need to say this and go the aggressive route. Or we could say, oh, I don't really need to say anything. And then it really isn't moving forward in health. So what needs to be said for us to move forward in this, to be healthy, versus what can be said? It just is kind of my distinguishing question that I ask myself, or I try to ask myself when I'm in those conversations. And, the truth is, when I'm emotional, I'm not as effective as at discerning that. Right.
Don't I
So,
know it?
so that is also something that I think is helpful is to have enough self-awareness to say, do I just need to remove myself from the conversation for now, and we can come back to it when I am going to be more productive or the other person is in an emotional state and can't hear what we're saying. And so that feels like we're hitting our head against the wall. So do we just need to come back to it when the other person's in a better space, if we think that that is possible, that they will be in a better space later? So
Yeah, I think I just want to add to that. Like, we really can pray for discernment. I
mhm,
mean, what I hear you saying is that it's a discernment process, right? Of what we
mhm,
should say and shouldn't say, and when, and what moment we choose to do that. And those are all important things. And we
mhm,
forget to pray for that sometimes, that God
mhm.
actually will give us that wisdom and discernment if we ask for it. So to be praying for that specifically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And to know ourselves too. I just know after a certain time in the evening, I should not be talking about anything important. I just shouldn't.
It's
I
so
mean,
funny.
I
It's
can
true.
answer questions of
Mm-hmm.
information, but like really to have a hard conversation, it just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't go as well as it does at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So knowing myself too.
No, it's so true. And knowing your spouse, because I think, a lot of these conversations we're having with our family members and knowing our kids or our extended
Mhm.
family, like when are things set up a little more for success? Set up for
Yeah.
success. That's always the
Mhm.
key phrase.
Mhm.
Well, okay, Alex, let's wrap this up. What is one thing that you're doing differently because of this series? Let's end on this question.
Well, I already did ask someone in my life as we were talking about some issues around depression and anxiety. Are you thinking about self-harm? I just said, okay, I'm just going to. And this person said, no, and kind of laughed. But I thought, one, I need to know this information
Mm-hmm.
just for your safety. But two, this is opening the door that this is something that is okay for us to talk about just by asking that. And I tried to do it in a loving and not an accusatory way, but to ask in a way that would indicate, if you are, I'm open to that. And I think I
Mm-hmm.
followed up this person's answer with something like, I would want to know if that's the case. So I'm always here for you to tell me.
Mm, that's really beautiful. Kayla's story was really sobering in that
Mm-hmm.
way. I feel like, really, her story is one that we could all fear, right? Like where you don't think someone is headed in a certain direction and they
Mm-hmm.
are. And so I think, yeah, that was really eye opening and important for us to hear.
Yeah, I, it will stick with me for sure. I think for a
Hmm.
really long time.
Yeah.
Um, okay, what about you? What's one thing that you're doing differently because of this series?
I feel like that question that Maggie and Shannon posed in their interview, where they said, if all of your friends look like you, now they weren't just referring to race, they were
Mm-hmm.
referring like across the board, um, then ask yourself why. And I think that question is just one, and I have been asking that for a few years in regards to race and into other areas as well. But who in my life looks differently than I do? Because that's a really good thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so, how can we reach out to people who are outside of our bubbles? And I think that's just we're really in talking about hard conversations, we like to stick in our bubbles because people think like us in our bubbles and
Right.
they act like us, and we can have all these really harmonious conversations. It's actually when we start reaching outside of those bubbles and having people in our lives that are different than we are, and we start to have opposing viewpoints, and
Mm-hmm.
that is a good thing and something we don't always see as a good thing. But when we become too insular, then we're only seeing life from one perspective and with one lens. And I don't want that for me personally. I want
Mm-hmm.
to I want to have a bigger lens than that. And I think God can give me a bigger lens through my relationships with other people.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's just a good reminder.
Yeah, because God's creation is bigger. And
Mm-hmm.
we forget that. It's so easy, no matter
Mm-hmm.
what it is. We talked about with Sarah about our own echo chambers
Mm-hmm.
and this idea of affirming what we already believe. And that gets us into trouble
Mm-hmm.
because, one, we have a very narrow view. It's not true. And God wants us to be pursuing truth, and to know what other people are thinking is part of knowing truth in the world. Is doesn't mean we have to agree with their viewpoint, but to know that it is true that other people have different ways of looking at the world helps us understand God's world better. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's good to be asking those hard questions. Hard
Well,
conversations lead to hard questions of ourselves.
it's true. Well, this has been a good series, Alex. I'm really glad we did it, and it's important. So, thanks for tackling the topics with me.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear what other kinds of hard conversations our listeners are having, because you are a world changer for good right where you are, which means you're having unique conversations to your life, and we'd love to hear about them.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thanks for being with us. And we are jumping in next week to Home for the Holidays, which most of us are home in some way for these holidays. But it's going to be more than that. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things to help us get ready to have a really rich and meaningful holiday season. All right. We will see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.